Hi everyone, this is Rod Ellison, and I wanted to put together a short video on how to create an augmented reality app in Unity with content that originates from an image. I had a need to take a 2D logo and turn it into a nice 3D object that would have some realistic shadows that could be used in an AR app. I'll break this up into two parts, with the first covering the process using Inkscape and Blender to turn a 2D image into a 3D model with Raytraced shadows, and then a second part that will look at building an ARFoundation app that uses that model as augmented reality content that can be scaled and rotated. So first things first, you're going to want to download the freely available Inkscape and Blender packages, as those are the main tools to set up the logo. I'm using Google search to find a random logo we can work with in this video. Some of these are more complex than others, but the general techniques I'll cover should work the same with any image you choose. And I'll just save this to my file system. So we'll switch over to Inkscape and we'll import the JPEG or PNG logo we just saved and position it in a workspace. As we bring the images into Inkscape, you'll notice the jagged edges or anti-aliased edges. This is the stuff we need to clean up. And to do that, we'll go up to the Path and Trace Bitmap dialog to set some settings to help us. Now I'm setting the colors and remove background checkboxes and radios as a starting point, and then you can hit OK and scroll in to see how close you're getting. So it looks like with these settings I'm still getting a little bit of a white feathered border, and I need to reduce that. So I'll reduce the scans a bit, and maybe a little better, but reducing it a little bit more. And it looks like that setting does it, a nice straight edge along the mustache. And now that we have a nice clean edged image, we can get rid of our original JPEG or PNG that we imported, and then you can resize the page to fit this image. And lastly, we'll file save this as a SVG image to your file system. So with the SVG file exported, we'll jump into Blender now, and I'll take a moment to explain the layout of this .blend file. Essentially up at the top right, you can see we have two cameras. One's perspective, one's top down. The cube, obviously you can see there is an object, and the shadow plane is the plane underneath that. And then a sun as our light source. Down at the bottom you can see the layer checkboxes. In the first layer we have the shadow plane, the second layer will be the object that we're working with that will cast a shadow, and the third layer will contain the cameras. So I'm going to get rid of the default cube and then switch to layer 2, where we will work out of for importing our SVG that will eventually become a mesh. And through a series of G keystrokes with the X and Y, I'll work to position it into the middle of the coordinate system, so we're basically at 0, 0. So with the Alt-C command, we will turn this curve into a mesh object that we can now work with. And I can apply the rotation and scale and location so that we have this object nicely centered with 0, 0 coordinates. And from there, I'm rotating at 90 degrees on the x-axis so it will stand vertically. So there's quite a bit of vertices, faces, and triangles in this object that are ultimately going to get bigger as we scale and extrude. So we need to minimize as much as we can so our AR app can be as performant as possible. As we switch into edit mode, you can see where these faces are coming from. There's a lot of detail that was created when we converted from curve to mesh. So we're going to use a few commands to start chiseling away at this and simplifying it. One technique that I use is to select a face and then hit Control and plus, so you can select adjacent faces. This allows you to slowly whittle away at the sheer number of faces and join up those that are connected to each other. And select linked faces is another menu item tool that you can use when you don't have an enclosed letter like an O, for example, that will combine all the faces Just like that, you saw the O join together, so I had to backtrack and use the Control+ method. So now looking again, we can see our faces has drastically been reduced down to 34 faces, but we still have some work to do with vertices and edges as we move into extruding this out into a 3D object. So with all the faces selected, I'm going to hit E and then extrude this out in the Y direction to create some depth in the actual 3D object. And I'll have to use a similar technique to select linked faces, and those faces that are very straight next to each other, to turn them into a common face so that we can further reduce the geometry in the object. Now, selecting the object over in the top right and then hitting the modifier tool with decimate is one additional way you can reduce geometry. So we'll scale this down as much as we can to keep the detail in the object, but reduce as many vertices, faces, and triangles that we can. With the object as optimized as you can, we'll now re-enable layer 1 so we can see our shadow plane and adjust our logo object, or the main object in level 2, to be right above the plane, because our intent is to ultimately cast a shadow and record that shadow that we can then use for our AR project. Now I'd like to get ready to prep for a render, but the material that came in with the original SVG was just pure black, so I'm going to change that to a diffuse material so that we can see shadows and lighting affected. And now we can just hit render and see how the current sun and lighting shadows are affecting the object. And ultimately what we're looking for is having the best possible shadow underneath the logo that is nicely ray traced and has a nice fade effect. So far we have the 3D object that we're eventually going to want to export as an FBX, but we also now need to isolate the shadow on the shadow plane just by itself as a transparent texture. We don't want the plane itself to render like it does now with a kind of a gray or diffuse material. And to do that, we're going to go to the shadow plane object and enable one of the properties called shadow catcher. So thus far we've been rendering through the perspective camera, but we're now going to shift to the top down camera and make that our active camera so we can project down and render the plane that's immediately below that camera. And you can adjust up and down through the Z scale to make sure that you're capturing the entirety of that square plane. So we need to go over to the Render Layers tab over on the right and essentially disable Layer 2, which has our object logo. We only want to capture the plane itself, and because the plane is a shadow catcher now, we should only render out the shadow that gets produced. And we can go to our camera settings and up our samples in the render so we get the best possible detail in our shadow. And next we'll go to the Scene tab, where we can enable the camera that's going to be the camera that renders to be the top-down camera. Now from there, we basically can up our denoise so we get more detail and quality in our shadow, and now we can hit render. With the higher settings for your render samples, your denoise, it is going to take a little longer for this to render, but ultimately you'll get a transparent texture with just the shadow. And then use the image save as image menu item to save out your transparent alpha shadow into its own file. And finally, we select both objects and then file export them as a single FBX, just those selected objects and just the mesh. We don't need the camera, we don't need the lights, and you'll have an object we can pull into Unity later.